extremely successful, very eventful, and on top of that, an extremely nice venue. So with that, let me give you a quick summary of our recently published Fall 2018 Regional Economic Outlook. As we highlight there, the recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean has lost some momentum vis-a-vis what we published in our spring meetings update of the Regional Economic Outlook. With tighter financial conditions, volatile commodity prices, and domestic vulnerabilities, economic recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean has both moderated and become more uneven. We have marked down growth forecasts for the region to 1.2% in 2018 and 2.2% in 2019. The moderating recovery is underpinned by divergent growth outcomes across the region. The recovery has slowed in some of the region's largest economy and turned into negative growth in the case of Argentina, as the impact of external headwinds has been amplified by domestic vulnerabilities and characteristics. In Brazil, short-term growth prospects are weighed down by the effects of the trucker strike in May and the recent tightening of financial conditions and the uncertainty surrounding the October elections in that country. In Mexico, lingering uncertainty on the final trade agreement in North America and tight financial conditions suggest that the economic recovery will be more gradual than originally expected. In a similar vein, higher oil prices coupled with increased political uncertainty have dampened the near-term outlook in several Central American countries, and there is still no end in sight to the economic and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Meanwhile, better terms of trade over the past year and improvements in consumer and business confidence have boosted the growth prospects in some Andean economies, and activity is recovering in the Caribbean, reflecting the important uptick in tourism owing to robust U.S. growth. A positive development is that despite the slowdown in regional economic activity, private investment is showing signs of life. Having contracted for 3 years in a row, private investment is estimated to have stopped being a major drag on growth in 2017 and is gaining further strength in 2018 and expected to accelerate in 2019. However, prospects for longer-term growth in Latin America and the Caribbean remain weak. Over the medium term, the region is estimated to grow at about 1.9% in per capita terms. This is well below the rates observed in emerging and developing economies, and essentially equal to that of advanced economies, suggesting that the region is not converging on average to the income levels of those advanced economies. As we have said before, against this backdrop, it's extremely important to the region to boost productivity growth and investment by increasing savings, by reducing the misallocation of resources, by making labor markets more flexible and reducing informality, liberalizing trade, fostering regional trade integration, improving the business climate, and continue strengthening anti-corruption frameworks. In terms of risks, we highlight in the document the potential effects of faster tightening of international financial conditions, obviously of the strengthening of trade tensions that we have seen among nations, and obviously this in the context of countries with weaker fundamentals has the potential of generating important economic volatility in some of the economies in the region. Let me just conclude by highlighting two important program operations that have been concluded recently. On the one hand, last week, the board of the IMF approved a program for Barbados that it's underpinned by significant strengthening of the policy framework in that country and an important debt restructuring that is taking place in Barbados recently. On the other hand, also some days ago, the managing director with Minister Duhovne from Argentina announced that we have reached a staff level agreement with respect to, let's say, the first review of the Argentina program that includes significant revisions to this program that will strengthen the financial aspects of the program, and on the other hand, significantly strengthens the policy framework that supports the financial arrangement. So with that, we will open the floor to your questions, and all the deputy directors of the department are here to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Alejandro. Please state your name and affiliation when I take the question. Yes, gentleman there.
Señores, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I'm Antonio Vargas. I come from Medellin. Dr. Banes knows that everything that we had to do to be able to get to this paradisical place. I have a couple of considerations. One you mentioned was about Argentina, but in Colombia as well, we're going to have to revise our quota, which is around $11 billion. Today, the Colombian Central Bank is saying that it needs to collect dollars for this purpose. I'd like to know what elements lead you to say that the IMF is going to have to revise downward the available quota, which means that there will be consequences. We've seen that the Colombian economy has managed this well over the last years. Many thanks. Our colleague will answer this question, but let me just say quite rapidly that the IMF is not revising anything downward. The Bank of the Republic, I think, is very prudently within its strategy of acquiring reserves, is basically considering that in the medium term, these reserves could be used as a partial substitute if the flexible line of credit were to have its amount reduced. But at no point has the fund said that we are going to have an intermediate revision of Colombia's credit line. And obviously the government is present on the board of the fund, and if I personally see the Colombian economy as one with very solid fundamentals and is a clear candidate for that line. But I would also have to see that what I understand and what I read in the announcement of the Bank of the Republic is this is simply a prudential movement to the extent that numbers are indicating to them that reserves could be a bit higher, so as to be able to follow the levels of trust and safety that the Colombian economy needs with full margins of liquidity, and to have a possibility in the future of those reserves being used as a substitute in case the line, as we have seen in the past, were to go down or to go up by an order of magnitude. We've seen in the past that there were both upward and downward movements in land at the request of the Colombian authorities. And so that's, I think, what is at the basis of that decision made. But perhaps my colleague Robert wants to add something.
The Colombian Central Bank, over a longer term period, needs to maintain an adequate level of reserves. Right now, the reserves are very strong. The economy is extremely well run. But you look over a long horizon, they'll need to find a time to continue accumulating reserves. So they're looking with a very long horizon. It's, as Alejandro said, it's a good prudential move. At the same time, as they see risks to the global economy gradually winding down, they feel there may be less use of the need for the credit line under the federal flexible credit line. So it's a couple of things working together, but it's prudential move. It's good management to make sure you have plenty of reserves, but thinking over a longer term horizon.
Okay, yes, gentleman up front there. And then.
Hola, soy Luis Miguel González de México.
I am Luis Miguel González from Mexico.
Not on the political side, but what is your take on Mexican next administration, the learning curve? I mean, we have been managed by several teams from the same group for about 2 decades. And the next administration is going to pass to different hands. So what's your take on the learning curve of the next administration on macroeconomic management and some of the most challenging issues? For example, the interest rate in the United States, energy policy, and things like that.
So can you give me your affiliation, your name and affiliation?
Sorry, El Economista de México.
Okay, thank you.
I think that right now, the incoming economic team is working very closely with the current authorities. There's a legal requirement to do that, so that on the side of the Ministry of Finance, there's a very close collaboration with the new government on how to design the budget. So there's a lot of learning going on right now, but the economic team being proposed by the new government is a group of very strong economists. The proposed Minister of Finance and the Undersecretary of Finance worked as Secretaries of Finance in the city, government of the City of Mexico when AMLO was the mayor. So they have experience in running governments. And the central bank will continue to be independent, and AMLO has said he will respect the autonomy of the central bank. And also the new economic team on the side of Hacienda has come out and said that they do value fiscal prudence, that they think it is important to continue to reduce public debt in relation to GDP. So they mentioned as overarching goals the need for fiscal prudence. So I think that so far I think that they're working with the incoming government, outgoing government very closely, and their stated objectives have been fairly sound. So I think the prospects are reasonably good.
Okay, thanks. I have one online question, and then I'll go to you, sir. Yes, if that's okay. The question is, the IMF estimates a deeper contraction for the Argentine economy than the government for this year and next. Given this divergence, will the government have to make additional spending cuts to those unforeseen in the budget presented to Congress to meet the fiscal goal of zero primary deficit?
So you may recall that the Argentine budget was actually prepared in advance of when we prepared the program with Argentina, and as you can tell, the situation there has moved quite quickly. So we've agreed a framework with the Argentine government, which is aligned with the forecast we produced this week. It's on the growth, it's some moderately weaker than was the assumptions put in the budget, but also our inflation forecasts were different, there are a number of different parameters in the forecast. The program will be based upon this agreed framework. For the budget, it doesn't make a great deal of difference because in the end, our growth is a little different, the inflation is a little different, the nominal GDP number is pretty similar, and what really matters for the budget will actually be the nominal GDP number because that determines what revenues will be and so forth. So in the end, it doesn't require, with this somewhat different framework, it doesn't require more fiscal measures. We're confident that the measures that have been proposed in the budget will be sufficient to achieve a zero balance. There's a little bit of a different composition in the macro numbers. And that will become evident when we publish the staff report that will show all of the underpinnings of the program.
Yes, sir. I think it's working. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
So first of all, I'm wondering, one of the big concerns is monetary policy normalization and how that is going to affect emerging markets. I'm wondering what risks of volatility you see in Latin America specifically, which countries you think are most vulnerable. And secondly, I wonder if any of you were in the meeting today about Venezuela. And if so, what was discussed, and specifically, was some sort of military action proposed?
É porque eu não quero.
This is something that Trump himself is sort of,
We need a microphone in order to hear the question.
what came out of that meeting?
Yeah, on the first question, this is an issue we've been raising in the past few quarters in terms of tightening financial conditions being a risk for many countries in Latin America. It's more about the abrupt tightening. If there's an abrupt tightening of financial conditions, that could affect could affect countries which have weak fundamentals and countries in particular which have large financing needs, especially in foreign currency. So there are many countries there, and you saw one was Argentina, which had this impact, but there are other countries which are also vulnerable in the region. And so this is one risk we've been highlighting for some time for the whole region.
With respect to Venezuela, I mean, we have been participating with various groups. I mean, basically laying out for them the work we have been doing following the Venezuelan economy, although we haven't done an article in that country since 2004. The team led by Robert has been, trying to piece together whatever information we can basically to make a macroeconomic analysis of what's going on in that country following, the significant collapse in economic activity and the humanitarian crisis that is going on in that country, and thinking how, if a Venezuelan government that reaches out to the international community could be helped by thinking on how to design an economic policy program to basically restore that economy to an inclusive growth path in the future. That's the work we have been doing. That's the work we have been sharing in different fora, in this meeting and in other meetings, and that's, the kind of meetings in which we participate. That's basically the work we have been doing in the case of Venezuela. On top of that, Venezuela has been sanctioned by our board for not providing economic statistics in a timely manner, and that process continues at the fund, and we continue to pursue that process.
Yes, the gentleman back there.
Thanks very much. Andy Robinson, La Vanguardia, daily newspaper in Barcelona. Just two very brief questions. One, just following up on that Venezuelan, could you, for example, the specifics of a possible strategy for Venezuela in the event that there was a government that reached out? Does it involve, for example, dollarization? Could you just give us a quick idea of what might be done? Secondly, I wanted to ask a question about Brazil. One of the market reaction, very positive market reaction to the results of the first round of the elections seems to have to do with an economic program that's being put out by the leading candidate for the second round, in which his top economic advisor puts forward a very radical privatization program as a means to tackle Brazil's debt sustainability crisis. I was at the Fiscal Monitor meeting in which public sector balances were discussed, assets and liabilities. And I wondered if you might just comment on the extent to which that policy that's being pushed out in the elections, and which is giving quite a lot of market reactions, giving quite a lot of credibility to that candidate, is actually sound economics. Thanks very much.
Rob, you want to take Venezuela?
Yeah, on Venezuela, it's a tough question to answer, A, because we don't get any information from the Venezuelan government. We haven't been there in many, many years. And also with hyperinflation, it's just a totally chaotic situation. So it would be hard to define a precise strategy at this stage. There's just too much uncertainty. So, it would require some fiscal measures. How much really depends on what the situation at the time they decide to stabilize. The choice of monetary and exchange rate regime, I think you have to decide when they actually begin to stabilize, because it's premature to make these decisions right now. So unfortunately, the answer is we don't really know. There's just a lot of confusion and there's a complete lack of information.
Yeah, on the issue of Brazil, any election provides an opportunity to embark on ambitious reforms. And as you know, Brazil is trapped in low growth, high debt, a fiscal sustainability problem. And as we've been talking for many months now, there are key areas where they need to work on. And one of the areas is on restoring fiscal discipline, which is, it involves many aspects of that. One is, of course, pension reform, addressing the public wage bill, And in that context, privatization also one of the elements. So there are many reforms which need to be addressed, which need to be undertaken. And one would hope that whoever comes to power has resolve and leadership to undertake these reforms, which can help this country on a path of strong growth and sustainability.
Yes, sure. Go ahead. And then gentleman over there.
But, you know, the IMF itself has released a paper in which it warns against the belief that the privatization of public assets is actually a means to get on a sustainable path for debt, right? I mean, that's the point I was trying to get at. Is it coherent to state that the privatization of Brazil's significant public assets would be a means to tackle its rising debt burden?
It is one element, right? There are many aspects to this.
Sorry, why is it an element, given the fact that in the presentation of the fiscal monitor, emphasis was given to the importance of public sector assets, and not just focusing on debt, but on the relationship between public sector assets and public sector liabilities?
Okay, I mean, look, I think obviously you have to take many of these things on a case-by-case basis, both case meaning countries and case meaning state-owned enterprises. I mean, obviously in the balance sheet of a country, suppose you have some on the liability side, you have your debt, on the asset side, you have your assets. And when we do our debt sustainability analysis, you have to pay the debt, you have to pay the debt service, and on the other hand, you have some assets that, I mean, hopefully produce net income for the government. Some cases, these assets do not provide net income. They actually provide net losses for the government. So that's a very clear example in which obviously getting rid of those assets, if somebody is willing to pay for them because they can actually use them to generate net income, it will be positive for the net worth of the government or the state. In many cases, you do have those cases in which you have net assets, that you have assets that are worth much more on the hands of the private sector than in the public sector, and in that case, it makes sense basically to have those assets being managed by the private sector from a perspective of the net worth of the government. So I think, I mean, if you look in depth on to the fiscal monitor issues, you cannot give a blanket response, but it is true that in many cases, a strategy of privatization of public sector assets might pay with respect to having a better net worth position for the government without sacrificing the welfare of the population. There are other cases in which maybe having those assets being managed by the government is actually welfare enhancing because those assets managed in a given way provide positive externalities for society that maybe the private sector will not try to maximize those. So I think the way the private sector deals with this question, the way the fiscal monitor deals with this question is basically saying we have to be careful and we have to study them on a case-by-case basis. But I think in the case of Brazil, in which they're facing a significant fiscal crisis, there are a lot of opportunities in which managing the wealth you have deployed in state-owned enterprises might pay off as part of the strategy to stabilize your debt to GDP and go back to a fiscal sustainable position.
Okay, thank you. Yes, gentleman there.
Hello, Alfonso Fernandez from the Spanish newswire EFE. Two questions. First one on Argentina. Do you have a date for the formal approval by the executive board of this new agreement? And the second one, in Nicaragua and Central America, you're forecasting a contraction in Nicaragua due to the political turmoil. Do you expect some economic contagion in the region in this year or the next one? Thank you.
So in Argentina, as you know, we announced a staff level agreement. There's always some short interval between when we announce a staff level agreement. We prepare the documents that underpin the standby arrangement, submit them to our executive board, and then the board is given some time to consider those documents before they meet. Our expectation is the board will meet before the end of this month, and then once they've met, then those documents will be published and people can see what's in the staff report.
Yeah, on Nicaragua, yes, we expect a decline this year of about 4% in GDP and continued contraction next year of about 1%. Basically, we've seen a decline in private consumption, in exports, and in investment. On the basis of data of August, we estimate the loss of jobs about 110,000 so far. And there's been a complete decline in tourism, transportation, and trade. Now, in terms of contagion, I mean, some links, for instance, in trade, the relative exports of neighboring countries to and from Nicaragua are not very high. But of course, there could be migration spillovers, there could be some banking spillovers. It depends how the situation evolves.
Right, thank you. Yes, sir.
Yolanda Morales del periódico El Economista en México.
Yolanda Morales from The Economist in Mexico. I'd like to ask, when there have been changes in countries' governments, you've said that we should take advantage of the political capital in order to bring about structural reforms. But and as you know, in Mexico, we've just had an election, and the president who won with a significant majority and with strong support from Congress. So my question is, do you think this would be a good time to apply structural reforms in Mexico? And what kind of reforms would have to be made? And what happens if the president-elect decides not to do that? I also would like to ask, you've been recommending rather for a few years that in Mexico an independent fiscal council be set up as other countries in Latin America have, namely Colombia. And I'd like to ask if this would be a good time, taking advantage of the political capital, would this be a good time to do it in Mexico?
Reforms, there are probably a couple of messages. One is to continue with the reforms that are already in place that were adopted in 2013. We know that the growth effects have been a lot less than what we've expected. That's sort of disappointing for everyone. But at the same time, all those reforms are in the right direction. And so it is important to continue with those. And over time, over a long horizon, the benefits will certainly be felt. The energy reform is key. Pemex doesn't have the budget to do all the investment in the oil sector that's needed, so the private sector will need to participate. So certainly maintaining the energy reform, I think, is very important for the productive capacity of the oil sector, but also of the country as well. Education reform, the competition reform, all those things are extremely important. In terms of reforms going forward, I think one issue that AMLO touched on is the issue of governance and strengthening, minimizing corruption. I think that's a very important issue. That's something that would sort of help make the economy work much more efficiently and also have a lot of other benefits for society. And informality continues to be a major issue in Mexico. A complex problem. There's no single solution, but I think working on reforms that address that and scale back informality would be very important.
All right.
And then on the Fiscal Council, let me get to that. We've been mentioning that as an issue for a while. I think with the new government, perhaps it might be a good moment to introduce something new. We still think it would provide important benefits to increase the transparency of fiscal policy. Any more analysis that the country can do, the legislative branch versus the executive branch, I think would all be to lead to a stronger fiscal policy. Mexico's fiscal policy is well run. We're not being critical of the direction, but still I think it would be better. It will be stronger, more credible with a fiscal council.
All right. Any further questions? Oh. Okay. Last two, and then I think we need to wrap up.
very short. What about the trade war? What the spillover to Latin America would you expect to be in the case, not of the most extreme scenario, but just things going the way they are with tariffs? Right now, we learned that Canada has imposed some tariffs on Mexico, some specific steel exports. So what do you expect that will be the impact to the region of the ongoing trade war?
I mean, maybe I think the numbers that we have run, both in the World Economic Outlook and in the Regional Economic Outlook, show that, I mean, the country most affected by uncertainty regarding trade policies in Latin America was Mexico. I mean, to the extent that the uncertainty associated with the free trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada has been weighing down on investment in Mexico for a long time. I mean, for, let's say, the last 18 months. So in that sense, the agreement that has been reached and has to be ratified by Congresses in the three countries is very positive news for the region. Going beyond that, I think all the simulations we have run point towards the result that even countries that might be beneficiaries from some kind of trade diversion that takes place between a trade war between other two countries might end up seeing those benefits eroded by the significant increase in uncertainty that takes place in the world economy. That's a little bit, I mean, the effect through uncertainty has been estimated to be rather large and having an important impact, and this effect eroding, in most of the cases, let's say, the trade diversion effects that can actually materialize in some countries. That's a little bit the result that we have gotten.
Microphone for the person asking the question.
Look, it depends how you model these things. But I think at this point, what we have been analyzing in the past, that, I mean, an economy so open such as Mexico, having such an important trade relationship with a much larger economy, obviously was one economy that had a lot to lose from this uncertainty, etc., and therefore achieving an agreement at the executive level, it's a very positive step to reduce this uncertainty. So vis-a-vis where we were 4 months ago, I mean, these three countries are in a much better position. Then if there will be another shock, another thing, that will be another discussion that we can have. But I think from a first order analysis, the effects that we saw, especially in the case of Mexico and through investment in the last 18 months, that were also reflected on exchange rate movements, I mean, throughout this period, I mean, actually are not going to be there in the future to the extent that this uncertainty is going to disappear, and a new free trade agreement will take place that all the analysts that have looked into it say that to the first approximation, maintain a pretty fluid trade relationship between these three countries, and therefore we will continue to see the kind of engagement in terms of trade and services that we saw before.
Okay, thank you. Last question.
If the world grows at 3.7%, then why is the region growing only at half that rate?
You want to take that?
So if you look at our forecast, there is, in addition to the fact that in some countries, some big countries like Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Mexico, things have slowed compared to what we'd expected in April, There are other parts where things are getting better, for example, in Colombia, Chile, and Peru. So we have both a slowing recovery and an uneven recovery. And a lot of it is because some of the risks which we had underscored in April, in terms of tightening financial conditions, in terms of trade tensions, in terms of volatile commodity markets, all these have had an impact on the countries where growth has slowed down significantly. So if you take that into account, that explains why, if you put everything together, that explains why our numbers are significantly below what we had in April. So the risks which we had underscored have materialized in full or in part, and it has affected some countries more than others. And that's why if you put these things together, you see a more significant slowdown in Latin America compared to the world.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Alejandro and the team. Thank you.